In a quiet American town, a group of bikers thought they found an easy target for their next extortion scheme, a cozy family bakery owned by an elderly woman. What they didn't know was that while she appeared vulnerable, her family was anything but ordinary. They would soon discover that her grandson was a Navy SEAL who had just returned from service, and when he learned they targeted his beloved grandmother, he would unleash hell upon them. The bikers would quickly realize that threatening this small family bakery would be their gravest mistake, one that would have severe consequences for their entire operation. Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The early morning sun cast a soft glow over the quiet market area as Maggie Dawson made her way to the bakery. At 70 years old, Maggie still took pride in running the family business she had nurtured for decades. The familiar sights and smells of the neighborhood brought a smile to her face as she approached the quaint storefront with its hand-painted sign, Dawson's Hearth Bakery, 1968. As Maggie unlocked the front door, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted out to greet her. She breathed it in deeply, savoring the comforting scent that had been a constant throughout her life. Inside, she found her two bakers, Rosa and Jerry, just finishing up their early morning shift. The kitchen was a flurry of activity as they completed the day's first batches of breads and pastries. "Good morning, Rosa, Jerry," Maggie called out cheerfully as she made her way to the back. "How did everything go this morning?" Rosa looked up from where she was pulling a tray of golden croissants from the oven. "Morning, Mrs. Dawson. Everything went smoothly. We just finished up the last of the morning bakes." Jerry nodded in agreement as he transferred warm loaves of sourdough to cooling racks. "Yep, no issues at all. We're right on schedule." Maggie smiled warmly at her dedicated employees. "Wonderful. Thank you both for your hard work. Why don't you go ahead and get changed? I'll do a final check of everything before we open." As Rosa and Jerry headed to the small employee locker area to change out of their flour-dusted uniforms, Maggie began her usual morning inspection. She moved methodically through the kitchen, checking that all the equipment was clean and in working order. Her experienced eye scanned the cooling racks of breads and pastries, noting with satisfaction the perfect golden brown crusts and appetizing aromas. In the front of the store, Maggie wiped down the display cases and countertops until they gleamed. She carefully arranged baskets of fresh breads and trays of pastries in the cases, creating an enticing display for the day's customers. As she worked, her mind drifted to memories of doing these same tasks alongside her parents decades ago when the bakery first opened. So much had changed over the years, but the heart of the business remained the same, creating delicious baked goods made with care and bringing warmth to the community. By the time Rosa and Jerry emerged in their street clothes, Maggie had finished her preparations. "Everything looks perfect," she told them with a smile. "Thank you again for all your hard work. I'll see you both tomorrow morning, same time." They nodded and said their goodbyes before heading out the back door. Maggie did one final sweep of the bakery, making sure everything was in its proper place. She counted the cash in the register, making change was properly stocked for the day ahead. Satisfied that all was in order, she flipped the sign on the front door from closed to open, precisely at 6:30 a.m. The first hour was usually quiet, which Maggie appreciated. It gave her time to ease into the day and savor these peaceful moments before the rush began. Her daughter Lorraine would arrive later to help with the busier periods, but Maggie enjoyed handling these early hours on her own. There was something deeply satisfying about still being able to run every aspect of the bakery she had poured her heart into for so long. The quiet morning was suddenly interrupted by the jingling of the bell above the door. Maggie looked up, surprised to have a customer so early. Her welcoming smile faltered as she took in the intimidating figure who had just entered. A tall man in a black leather jacket stood just inside the doorway, his face partially obscured by the motorcycle helmet he was removing. Even from across the room, Maggie could see the man's muscular build and the hint of tattoos peeking out from his collar. An uneasy feeling settled in her stomach as the stranger's eyes swept across the bakery, taking in every detail. Maggie swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady as she called out, "Good morning!" "Welcome to Dawson's Hearth. What can I get for you today?" The man said nothing, continuing to study the bakery as he slowly approached the counter. His heavy boots echoed on the tile floor with each deliberate step. Maggie's heart began to race, but she forced herself to maintain a calm exterior. When he finally reached the counter, the man's piercing gaze settled on Maggie. His voice was gruff as he asked, "Who owns this place?" Maggie hesitated for a moment before answering truthfully, "I do." "I'm Margaret Dawson. Is there something I can help you with?" A humorless chuckle escaped the man's lips. He took another step closer, causing Maggie to instinctively back up slightly. "How much does this little bakery make you?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of menace. Alarm bells were ringing in Maggie's head now. She straightened her spine, summoning her courage, as she replied firmly, "I'm sorry, but that's private business information. If you're not here to make a purchase, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're making me uncomfortable." The man's lips curled into a predatory grin. He gestured to the wooden sign hanging above the counter. "Dawson's Hearth Bakery, established 1968, and said, 'You must be doing pretty well to have survived this long. Impressive.'" Before Maggie could respond, the man turned and began walking towards the door. Over his shoulder, he called out, "We will be back soon. See you." The bell jingled again as he exited, leaving a shaken Maggie alone in the suddenly too quiet bakery. She watched through the window as the man mounted a large motorcycle parked out front. The roar of the engine filled the air as he sped off, leaving behind only a cloud of exhaust and Maggie's growing sense of dread. With trembling hands, Maggie hurried to lock the front door and flipped the sign back to closed. Her mind was racing as she tried to process what had just happened. Who was that man? What did he want? And what did he mean by "we will be back"? Maggie stood motionless behind the counter, the weight of the encounter pressing down on her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the counter to steady herself. She barely registered the sound of the back door opening until Rosa and Jerry's concerned voices cut through her daze. "Mrs. Dawson," Rosa asked, stepping closer, "are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jerry frowned, glancing toward the front door. "Was someone just here? We heard a loud noise. Sounded like a motorcycle engine." Maggie swallowed hard, forcing a small smile onto her lips. "Oh, it was nothing, just a biker passing through." Rosa and Jerry exchanged doubtful glances. "Are you sure?" Rosa pressed gently. "You look shaken." Maggie hesitated, debating whether to confide in them, but she didn't want to worry them. Not yet. Instead, she squared her shoulders and forced a reassuring nod. "Yes, really." "Everything's fine. You two should head home." Jerry hesitated before nodding, though the worry didn't leave his eyes. "All right, if you're sure, just call if you need anything, okay?" Rosa lingered a moment longer before giving Maggie's arm a gentle squeeze. "Take care, Mrs. Dawson." As they left, Maggie exhaled slowly, rubbing her arms as if to ward off the lingering chill in the air. Her mind raced with unanswered questions, but one thing was clear. She couldn't handle this alone. With a deep breath, she reached for her phone from her purse. "Lorraine will know what to do," she murmured to herself, before dialing her daughter's number. As the phone rang, Maggie sent up a silent prayer that Lorraine would answer. "Hey, Mum. Is everything okay?" Lorraine's concerned voice came through the phone after 3 rings. "Yep. Lorraine, honey, I need you to come to the bakery right away," Maggie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Something's happened." What's wrong?" Lorraine asked, her tone sharpening with worry. Maggie took a deep breath before explaining. "There was a man here, a very intimidating man. He was asking strange questions about the bakery and how much money we make. He said we would be back soon. I'm scared, Lorraine." "Oh my God," Lorraine breathed. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" No, I'm fine," Maggie assured her. "He didn't touch me, but the way he looked at me, the things he said, I've never felt so frightened in my own bakery before." "I'm on my way right now," Lorraine said firmly. "Don't open the bakery again until I get there. Just stay inside and keep the doors locked, okay?" "Okay," Maggie agreed, feeling a wave of relief at her daughter's calm competence. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll see you soon." After hanging up, Maggie tried to busy herself with small tasks to keep her mind occupied while she waited for Lorraine. She stepped into the bakery's kitchen, returning ingredients to their shelves, wiping down the workbenches and mopping the floor. But her eyes kept darting to the front windows, scanning the street outside for any sign of the menacing stranger returning. It felt like hours, but was really only about 15 minutes before Maggie heard a key in the lock. She tensed for a moment before Lorraine's familiar voice called out, "Mom?" "It's me." Maggie hurried to the front, throwing her arms around her daughter in a tight hug. "Oh, Lorraine, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice muffled against Lorraine's shoulder. Lorraine hugged her back just as tightly before pulling away to look her mother over with concern. "Are you sure you're all right? You look pale." "I'm okay," Maggie assured her. "Just shaken up, that man. There was something so menacing about him. I've never felt unsafe in this bakery before today." "Tell me everything," Lorraine said, guiding her mother to sit at one of the small cafe tables near the front windows. As Maggie recounted the encounter in detail, Lorraine's frown deepened. "And you said he had tattoos?" "Did you notice anything specific?" she asked. Maggie thought for a moment. There was something on his neck, peeking out above his jacket collar. I couldn't make out what it was exactly, but it looked like some kind of symbol. Lorraine nodded grimly. "And the motorcycle, was it a particular type or color?" "It was big, that's all I really noticed," Maggie admitted. "Oh, and black, definitely black." "Okay," Lorraine said, her mind clearly working through the information. "And he specifically commented on how long the bakery has been open, like he was noting our success?" Maggie nodded. "Yes, he pointed right at the sign with our establishment date, said it was impressive we'd survived this long." Lorraine's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't like this at all, Mum. It sounds like he was scoping the place out, maybe for some kind of protection racket or extortion scheme." "You really think so?" Maggie asked, her eyes widening. "Oh, I knew I shouldn't have put that sign up with our establishment date. It just draws attention." "No, Mum, that's not the problem," Lorraine said firmly. "There's nothing wrong with being proud of the business our family have built. We shouldn't have to hide our success out of fear." Maggie nodded but still looked unconvinced. Lorraine reached across the table to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "Look, why don't we get some breakfast and talk through this? Have you eaten yet today?" When Maggie shook her head, Lorraine stood up. "All right, I'm going to make us both some food. We'll figure this out together, okay?" As Lorraine busied herself in the kitchen, preparing some sandwiches, Maggie's gaze drifted back to the windows. The market area outside was coming to life now as other shops began to open. The familiar sights of the neighborhood she'd known for decades should have been comforting, but now they just reminded her how much she had to lose if something happened to the bakery. Lorraine returned a few minutes later, with 2 plates laden with thick slices of fresh bread, topped with eggs and cheese. As they ate, she tried to reassure her mother. "I know this is scary, Mum, but try not to jump to the worst conclusions. In all these years, nothing like this has ever happened before. It could just be some kind of cruel prank or maybe an angry customer trying to intimidate you." "I hope you're right," Maggie said with a sigh. "But what if it's not? What if they really do come back?" "Then we call the police immediately," Lorraine said firmly. "No matter what time of day or night, if that man or anyone suspicious shows up again, you call 911 right away. Okay?" Maggie nodded but still looked uncertain. "The police station is so far from here, though. It would take them ages to arrive, and you know how slow they can be sometimes. This town has been peaceful for so long, I don't think they're equipped to handle real trouble anymore." Lorraine reached out to squeeze her mother's hand. "I know it's scary, but we can't let fear control us. We'll take precautions, but we can't shut down the bakery or live in constant worry. That's exactly what people like that want, to make us feel powerless." Maggie managed a small smile. drawing strength from her daughter's steady presence. "You're right, of course. I don't know what I'd do without you, sweetheart." They lapsed into silence for a few moments as they finished their food. Then Maggie looked up suddenly, as if remembering something. "Oh, how is Jax doing? You mentioned last week that he'd be coming home soon from his latest deployment, didn't you?" Lorraine nodded, a proud smile spreading across her face at the mention of her son. "That's right. He should be back tomorrow, actually, though the exact timing isn't confirmed yet. You know how it is with the military, plans can change at a moment's notice." "It will be so wonderful to see him," Maggie said, her earlier fears temporarily forgotten in the anticipation of her grandson's return. "I do worry about him with that dangerous work he does, but I'm so proud of him too." "Me too, Mum," Lorraine agreed. "And who knows, maybe having a Navy SEAL around will make any troublemakers think twice about bothering us." Maggie chuckled softly. "From your lips to God's ears, dear." As they cleared away their breakfast dishes, both women felt a little lighter. The warm food and companionship had done wonders to ease the tension of the morning. But as Maggie glanced at the clock on the wall, she realized with a start that it was already past their usual opening time. "Oh my, look at the time," she exclaimed. "We should open up. Our regulars will be wondering what's happened to us." Lorraine hesitated. "Are you sure you're up for it, Mum? We could stay closed today if you need more time." But Maggie shook her head firmly. "No, you're right. I won't let that man scare me away from my own bakery. We have a business to run and customers who depend on us. Let's get to work." With a mixture of pride and concern, Lorraine watched as her mother straightened her apron and moved purposefully towards the front door. As Maggie flipped the sign to open and unlocked the door, Lorraine silently vowed to keep a close eye on things. Whatever trouble might be brewing, she was determined to protect her mother and the bakery that meant so much to their family. The cheerful jingling of the bell above the door signaled the arrival of their first customers of the day. Maggie tensed instinctively at the sound, but relaxed when she saw the familiar faces of their regular morning crowd filing in. "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson. Running a bit late today, aren't we?" called out Mr. Jenkins, a retired teacher who had been coming in for his morning coffee and scone for as long as Maggie could remember. Maggie managed a warm smile, determined not to let her earlier fright show. "Just a bit of a slow start this morning, Mr. Jenkins, but we're open now and everything's fresh as always." As she and Lorraine fell into their usual rhythm of serving customers and keeping the display cases stocked, Maggie found herself gradually relaxing. The familiar routines and friendly chatter of their regulars helped push the memory of the menacing stranger to the back of her mind. The morning rush kept them both busy, with barely a moment to catch their breath between orders. Maggie manned the cash register while Lorraine worked the small cafe area, warming pastries and brewing fresh pots of coffee to keep up with demand. By the time the crowd thinned out around 11:30, both women were ready for a break. Lorraine glanced at the clock and said, "Mom, I'm going to run home quick to feed Cookie. You okay here for a bit?" Maggie nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, dear. Give that sweet puppy a pat from me." As Lorraine gathered her things, Maggie moved to flip the open sign to closed for their usual lunch break. She watched through the window as her daughter disappeared down the street, then turned back to survey the now quiet bakery. With the whirlwind of the morning rush over, Maggie found her earlier fears creeping back in. The silence that usually felt peaceful now seemed oppressive. Her eyes were drawn to the wooden sign above the counter. Dawson's Hearth Bakery established. 1968, that had caught the biker's attention. Maggie's mind drifted back to those early days when her parents had first opened the bakery. She had been just a teenager then, eager to help out in any way she could. The memory of her father's proud smile as he hung that sign for the first time brought a lump to her throat. This wasn't just a business, it was a family legacy, a fixture in the community for over 5 decades. They had weathered so many challenges over the years. Maggie could still remember the lean times in the early years, when her father had taken out loans just to keep the doors open. There had been days when loan sharks had shown up, making thinly veiled threats. How terrifying that must have been for her mother. But they had survived it all through hard work and the loyalty of their customers. Maggie straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from those memories. If her parents could face down loan sharks and keep this bakery going through tough times, surely she could handle one intimidating biker. "We've come too far to let anyone scare us off now," Maggie murmured to herself. She pulled her cell phone from her apron pocket, making sure it was easily accessible in case she needed to call for help quickly. With renewed determination, Maggie headed to the back room to make herself a cup of tea. A little caffeine and a moment of quiet reflection would help steady her nerves. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she took several deep breaths, focusing on the comforting, familiar scents of the bakery. Just as she was pouring the hot water over her tea bag, the sharp jingling of the bell above the front door made her jump. Maggie's heart began to race as she remembered Lorraine had flipped the closed sign before leaving. Who would be coming in now? For a moment, Maggie considered staying hidden in the back room, but she squared her shoulders and slowly made her way towards the front of the shop. She had faced down her fears once already today. She could do it again. As Maggie emerged from the back room, her breath caught in her throat. Standing just inside the doorway were three large men in leather biker vests. One of them she recognized immediately as the menacing stranger from that morning. The other two were equally intimidating, tall, muscular, with hard eyes that scanned the bakery like predators sizing up their prey. The bell above the door gave one final, almost mocking jingle as it swung shut behind them with a loud thump. Maggie flinched at the sound, her racing heart seeming to echo the finality of that closing door. The man she recognized from earlier stretched his lips into that same unnerving grin she remembered. "Well, hello there," he drawled. "Told you we'd be back, didn't I?" Maggie swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady as she replied, "We're closed right now for lunch. Didn't you see the sign on the door?" One of the other men chuckled darkly. "Oh, we saw it all right, just didn't much care." They began to advance further into the shop, spreading out slightly as if to block any potential escape routes. Maggie backed up until she felt the solid presence of the counter behind her. "Now listen here," she said, summoning every ounce of authority she could muster. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but I'm warning you to leave. Otherwise, I'll call the police." The three men exchanged amused glances before the leader spoke again. "Ah, but we do have business here, ma'am. It's time for you to pay up." Maggie's brow furrowed in confusion. "Pay for what? I don't owe you anything." "Oh, but you do," the man replied smoothly. "You see, we're the new management around these parts, and we require a little protection fee from all the local businesses." A chill ran down Maggie's spine as the full implications of their words sank in. This was exactly what Lorraine had feared, some kind of extortion racket. Her hand inched towards the pocket of her apron where her cell phone was tucked away. "This is a peaceful town," Maggie said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. "We don't need any kind of protection. Now I'm telling you one last time to leave, or I really will call the police." The men's amusement seemed to evaporate, replaced by a dangerous glint in their eyes. "We're not asking, old lady," one of them growled. "This is a command." As they took another menacing step forward, Maggie's trembling fingers finally closed around her phone. She pulled it out and quickly hit the emergency call button, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the ringing. The leader's eyes narrowed as he watched her. "Tell me, how long do you think it will take for the police to get here? Do you really think they'll be fast enough?" As he spoke, he reached behind his back and pulled out a wicked-looking knife, the blade glinting in the soft light of the bakery. Maggie's blood ran cold at the sight of the weapon. She could hear a tinny voice coming from her phone, asking if there was an emergency, but she found herself frozen in fear. One of the other men spoke up, his tone mocking. "Careful there, Granny. Wouldn't want to have an accident with that phone, would we? Why don't you just tell the nice operator it was all a mistake?" With shaking hands, Maggie raised the phone to her ear. I'm sorry," she stammered. "This was an accidental call. My phone was in my pocket." "Very good," the leader said with a cruel smile as Maggie ended the call. "See, We can be reasonable when people cooperate. Maggie's mind raced, searching desperately for a way out of this nightmare. But with the knife still pointed in her direction and the men blocking her path to the door, she realized with growing dread that she was trapped. "Now then," the leader continued, gesturing towards the cash register with his free hand. "Why don't you open that up and hand over today's earnings? Nice and easy, and we can all be on our way." Maggie hesitated, her sense of self-preservation warring with her instinct to protect the bakery's hard-earned income. But another menacing step forward from the knife-wielding man had her scrambling to comply. With trembling fingers, she punched in the code to open the register. The soft ding as the drawer popped open seemed obscenely loud in the tense silence of the bakery. The leader stepped forward, roughly shoving Maggie aside as he began scooping handfuls of cash into a small duffel bag. "Well, well," he said with a low whistle, "quite the little gold mine you've got here, aren't you? Must be the favorite spot in town." As the man emptied the register, one of his companions wandered over to the display cases, eyeing the remaining pastries hungrily. He reached out, snagging a flaky Danish and taking an enormous bite. Maggie watched in helpless anger as crumbs rained down onto her freshly mopped floors. When the leader finished clearing out the register, he turned back to Maggie with a cold smile. "Usually we only take a percentage, you understand. But since you were so uncooperative today, wasting our valuable time, well, we'll just have to take it all to make up for it." He zipped up the bag of cash and tossed it to one of his companions before leaning in close to Maggie. She could smell tobacco and something harsher on his breath as he growled, "We'll be back again soon. And I expect you to be much more agreeable next time. Do you understand me?" Maggie could only manage a tiny nod, her whole body rigid with fear. But before the men could make their exit, the bell above the door jangled once more. Maggie's heart leapt with a mixture of relief and fresh terror as a familiar voice called out, "Granny! What's going on here?" Maggie's eyes widened as she saw her grandson Jack standing in the doorway. His tall, muscular frame filled the entrance, a look of confusion quickly morphing to anger as he took in the scene before him. "Jax!" Maggie cried out, a mixture of relief and fear in her voice. "Oh, thank God you're here!" The leader of the bikers, still brandishing his knife, whirled to face the newcomer. "Don't try anything stupid," he snarled, gesturing threateningly with the blade, "or your beloved granny here might have an unfortunate accident." Jax raised his hands slowly, his voice steady as he said, "Easy now. Let's all just calm down and talk this through." He took a cautious step forward, but froze when the man with the knife jerked it warningly in Maggie's direction. "Stay right where you are," the biker growled. "One more step and things are going to get real messy for Grandma here." Jax remained in the doorway, his hands still raised non-threateningly, but Maggie could see the tension in his body, like a coiled spring ready to snap. His eyes darted around the room, assessing the situation with the trained precision of his military background. The bikers, momentarily thrown off by Jax's arrival, quickly regained their bravado. The one who had been eating pastries earlier let out a mocking laugh. "Look at this, boys. The little soldier thinks he's going to play hero." But even as they taunted Jax, Maggie noticed a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. The easy target they'd expected had suddenly become much more complicated. Just as the tension in the room reached a breaking point, the distant wail of police sirens cut through the air. The bikers' heads snapped towards the sound, their faces paling. Seconds later, a police cruiser screeched to a halt outside the bakery. Two officers emerged with weapons drawn, shouting orders for everyone to freeze. The leader of the bikers cursed violently, his eyes darting between the approaching police and Jax, who was still blocking the doorway. For a heart-stopping moment, Maggie feared he might lash out with the knife in desperation. But as one of the officers pressed his gun to the back of the leader's head through the open doorway, commanding him to drop and kick the weapon away, the fight seemed to drain out of him. The knife first clattered to the floor before it skidded to the far side of the room, and Maggie let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. In a flurry of activity, the police swarmed into the bakery. The bikers were quickly disarmed and cuffed, their protests and excuses falling on deaf ears. Maggie watched in stunned silence as the men who had terrorized her just moments ago were led away in handcuffs. As soon as the immediate threat was neutralized, Jax rushed to Maggie's side. "Granny, are you all right?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for any signs of injury. "Did they hurt you?" Maggie shook her head, still trembling slightly. No, I'm okay," she assured him, leaning into his strong embrace. "Oh, Jax, I'm so glad you're here, but how? I thought you weren't coming home until tomorrow." Jax guided her gently to a nearby chair, kneeling beside her as he explained. "Mom called me early this morning. She was worried about some trouble at the bakery. I managed to get an early leave when my commanding officer heard about the situation." He glanced towards the door where the police were still securing the scene. "I was on my way here when I ran into Mom. She told me about the biker from this morning, so I was already on high alert. When I got here and saw those bikes parked outside, well, I had a feeling something was wrong." Jax's face darkened as he continued. "I spotted a police cruiser nearby and flagged them down. Told them I suspected a robbery in progress. We agreed that if I raised my hands when I entered, it would be the signal for them to move in." Maggie's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "Oh, Jax," she said softly, reaching out to cup his cheek. "You're our hero. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up when you did." As the adrenaline of the moment began to fade, Maggie found herself studying her grandson more closely. It had been months since she'd seen him, and the changes were subtle but noticeable. There were new lines around his eyes, a certain wariness in his gaze that spoke of the hardships he'd faced in his military service. But when he smiled at her, she still saw the same kind-hearted boy who had grown up playing in this very bakery. "I'm just glad I got here in time, Granny," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Those guys won't be bothering you again." As Maggie's racing heart began to slow, she noticed Jax glancing around the bakery with a slightly puzzled expression. Following his gaze, she realized what was bothering him. The police seemed to be wrapping up their work remarkably quickly. Jax stood up, his brow furrowed as he approached one of the officers. "Excuse me," he said politely but firmly. "Don't you need to take our statements? And shouldn't there be more backup on the way?" The officer, whose nameplate identified him as Officer Grayson, gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "No need to worry about all that right now, son. We've got the situation under control." Jax's frown deepened. "With all due respect, sir, this seems like a pretty serious situation. 3 armed men attempting to rob and threaten a local business owner. Shouldn't there be detectives on the way? Crime scene investigators?" Officer Grayson exchanged a quick glance with his partner before forcing a smile. "Look, we appreciate your concern, but this is a small town. We don't have all those fancy big city resources. We'll get statements from you folks in the next day or two, all right? For now, just be glad we got here when we did." Maggie, seeing the doubt on Jax's face, quickly spoke up. "It's all right, dear. This has always been such a quiet, safe area. I'm sure the officers know what they're doing." The police seemed eager to seize on Maggie's words. "That's right, ma'am," Officer Grayson said with a nod. "We'll be in touch to schedule a time for official statements. For now, why don't you folks try to get some rest? It's been quite an exciting morning for you." Jax looked like he wanted to argue further, but a gentle touch on his arm from Maggie made him hold his tongue. He watched with narrowed eyes as the officers finished up their cursory investigation and prepared to leave. Just before they got into the car, Officer Grayson's partner, whose nameplate read Harris, stopped to chain the bikers' motorcycles to a pole near the porch. "We'll have someone pick these up later," he said briefly before following his partner to the vehicle. As the police cruisers pulled away, their sirens blessedly silent now, Maggie joined him at the porch, both of them watching as the vehicles disappeared around a corner. Through the car window, Jax caught sight of the 3 large men sitting quietly in the back of the lone cruiser, a sight that just didn't quite fit. Something about their demeanor struck him as odd. They seemed almost too calm, too accepting of their fate. Jax and Maggie stepped back into the bakery. Just as Jax was about to share his thoughts with his grandmother, the bell above the door jingled again. He turned to see Lorraine hurrying in, her face lined with concern. In her arms was Cookie, the family's cherished spaniel puppy, who instantly began squirming to be set free. "Mom!" Jack's exclamation mark, Lorraine cried, her eyes darting between them. "What happened?" "I saw the police cars leaving. Are you both all right?" As Jax began to fill his mother in on the morning's events, Maggie found her attention drawn to Cookie. The puppy had wriggled free from Lorraine's grasp and was now sniffing intently around the bakery floor. His nose led him unerringly to the spot where the biker's knife had fallen, and he began to bark insistently. Jax broke off his explanation, following Cookie's gaze to the knife that still lay partially hidden beneath a bread rack. His eyes widened in disbelief. "They didn't even collect the weapon as evidence," he muttered, a note of anger creeping into his voice. Pulling out his phone, Jax quickly snapped several photos of the knife, making sure to capture the chipped edges where it had hit the floor, as well as its exact location and condition. "Don't touch it," he warned Maggie and Lorraine. "There could still be fingerprints or other forensic evidence." Lorraine looked bewildered by this turn of events. "But surely the police will come back for it? Maybe they just overlooked it in the chaos." Jax shook his head grimly. The way those officers handled the situation, "It wasn't by the book," he explained, his voice low and serious. "They should have called for backup, given the nature of the crime. And the way the bikers just surrendered without a fight, it doesn't add up. And now this?" He gestured to the forgotten knife. "No, there's more going on than meets the eye." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine at Jax's words. The sense of relief she'd felt at the biker's arrest was quickly giving way to a new kind of unease. If they couldn't trust the police to handle this properly, who could they turn to? Jax's mind raced as he tried to piece together the unsettling events of the morning. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every fiber of his being was screaming that something was deeply wrong with this situation. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice low and serious. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but the way those officers handled this, it's way out of protocol. 2 officers restraining 3 big men, one of whom was armed, and they didn't even search for additional weapons, and those bikers were way too calm when they were arrested." Maggie wrung her hands nervously. "But what does that mean, Jax? Surely the police wouldn't... I mean, they're here to protect us, aren't they?" Jax sighed heavily. "In an ideal world, yes, but corruption can happen anywhere, Granny, and in small towns like this, where resources are limited and oversight might be lax, it's not unheard of for some bad apples to take advantage." Lorraine, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "So what are you going to do?" "Should we call someone? The state police, maybe?" "Not yet," Jax said, shaking his head. "We don't have enough concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Like you said, they could easily claim it was just an overlooked piece of evidence. For now, we need to be cautious and gather more information." Jax's jaw set in determination. "I'm going to head to the police station to check on a few things, see what I can find out about these bikers and why they've suddenly shown up in town. And I'll keep an eye on those 2 officers, Grayson and Harris. Something about them doesn't sit right with me." He turned to his grandmother and mother. "I think it might be best if you close up shop early today and go home. Lock the doors and stay safe." Maggie's brow furrowed with concern. "Close early?" "But Jax, we still have so much left to sell. You know we don't keep bread overnight. It's always been our policy. We'd have to throw everything away." Jax looked around the bakery, taking in the shelves still laden with loaves and pastries. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice, lecturing about waste and the importance of using every last crumb. It had been a lesson born of harder times, when the bakery was just starting out and every penny counted. After a moment's consideration, Jax nodded. "All right, you can stay open, but only for a few more hours, 3 at most. Make sure you close before it gets dark. We don't know how big this biker group is or how many of them might still be out there." Maggie and Lorraine exchanged glances before agreeing. "We'll keep the store open while we tidy up the kitchen and prep for tomorrow," Lorraine said. "Once that's done, we'll close up." "Good," Jax said. He then helped Maggie collect the day's earnings that the biker had stolen from the register, but ultimately abandoned. And remember to keep today's earnings somewhere safe at home, not here at the bakery. We don't know how far this operation extends, he explained. Better safe than sorry. As Jax prepared to leave, Maggie suddenly insisted he take her car. Despite his multiple attempts to refuse, his grandmother was adamant. Finally, Jax relented, accepting the keys with a grateful smile. The familiar weight of the old key fob in his hand brought back memories of learning to drive in that very car, Maggie patiently guiding him through the quiet streets of their town. "Be careful," Maggie said, pulling him into a tight hug. Her embrace was warm and smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, scents that had always meant home and safety to Jax. Now they served as a poignant reminder of what he was fighting to protect. "I promise I'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly. "No one threatens our family and gets away with it." He took one last look around the bakery, his eyes landing on the forgotten knife still lying beneath the bread rack. As he exited the bakery and climbed into Maggie's old sedan, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was diving headfirst into something far more dangerous than he had initially realized. But with his family's safety on the line, he knew he had no choice but to see this through to the end. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as Jax navigated Maggie's old sedan through the familiar streets of his hometown. The car's engine hummed softly, a sound that had been the backdrop to countless childhood trips and teenage adventures. Now it seemed to underscore the gravity of his current mission. As he drove, Jax couldn't help but notice how little the town had changed over the years. The same storefronts lined Main Street, their signs faded but still proudly proclaiming businesses that had been around for generations. Children played in front yards, their laughter carrying on the warm summer air. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful, that the idea of a corrupted police force and violent biker gang operating beneath the surface felt almost absurd. The local police station came into view, a squat brick building that had seen better days. Its windows reflected the golden light of the setting sun, giving it an almost warm appearance that belied Jax's suspicions about what might be happening inside. Pulling into the nearly empty parking lot, Jax took a moment to collect himself. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, noting the determined set of his jaw and the lingering bruises from his earlier encounter. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and made his way to the entrance. The interior of the station was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the warm evening outside. The smell of stale coffee and paper hung in the air, mingling with the sharp scent of industrial cleaner. A bored-looking receptionist glanced up as Jax approached the desk, her expression a mixture of disinterest and mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice as flat as the fluorescent lighting overhead, before she noticed his pristine white U.S. Navy SEAL uniform. Jax put on his most charming smile, ignoring the twinge of pain from his split lip. "Yes, ma'am. I'm hoping to speak with Officers Mark Grayson and Jake Harris. They responded to an incident at my grandmother's bakery earlier today." The receptionist's fingers clacked against her keyboard, the sound echoing in the empty lobby. After a moment, she looked back up at Jax, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "I'm sorry, but Officers Grayson and Harris are currently still out on patrol. They haven't returned to the station yet." Jax's brow furrowed, a flicker of suspicion igniting in his mind. "I see. Well, perhaps you could help me then. I was wondering if any paperwork had been filed yet regarding the arrest of 3 bikers at Dawson's Hearth Bakery." The woman's expression shifted from boredom to confusion, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Jax more closely. "Bikers? I'm not seeing any record of such an arrest. Are you sure it was today?" Jax felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "Yes, I'm certain. It happened just a few hours ago. The officers took 3 men into custody." The receptionist shook her head, her frown deepening. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no record of that incident in our system, and without an official case file, I can't give you any more information." For a moment, Jax considered mentioning the knife evidence left at the bakery. The weight of the secret felt heavy on his tongue, urging him to share it with someone in authority. But as he opened his mouth to speak, a wave of caution washed over him. If his suspicions about corruption were correct, Revealing that information to the wrong person could be disastrous. "I understand," Jack said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you for your time." As he walked back to the car, Jax's mind whirled with implications. No arrest record, no case file. It was as if the entire incident at the bakery had never happened. The sense of wrongness that had been nagging at him all day suddenly crystallized into a cold, hard certainty. Something was very, very wrong with the local police force. Lost in thought, Jax almost missed the gas gauge warning light blinking on the dashboard. Glancing at the fuel indicator, he realized the tank was nearly empty. A pang of guilt hit him as he remembered how much of his grandmother's gas he had used. Always conscientious, Jax decided to fill up before returning the car. He pulled into a nearby gas station, the neon signs flickering to life as the day began to fade. As he began pumping gas, a familiar sight caught his eye. There, parked in the lot, was the police cruiser he had seen earlier at the bakery. Officers Grayson and Harris were leaning against the vehicle, sipping coffee and chatting casually, as if they didn't have a care in the world. Jax's heart rate quickened, adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. He forced himself to act natural, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he finished fueling. As he made his way inside to pay, he couldn't help but notice that the back seat of the cruiser was empty. There was no sign of the 3 bikers who should have been in custody. At the counter, Jax paid for his gas, his mind racing with possibilities and suspicions. On impulse, he decided to approach the officers, steeling himself for the confrontation. "Good day, officers," he called out, injecting a note of friendly casualness into his voice. "Fancy seeing you here." Officer Grayson's eyes widened in recognition, a flicker of something, surprise, worry, crossing his face before he schooled his features into a neutral expression. "Well, if it isn't our hero from the bakery, everything all right?" Jax nodded, maintaining his casual demeanor even as his instincts screamed that something was very wrong. "Yes, thank you. Actually, I just came from the station. I was hoping to give my official statement about what happened." The officers exchanged a quick glance that didn't escape Jax's notice. It was brief but loaded with meaning. Officer Harris cleared his throat, his hand moving almost imperceptibly towards his weapon. "Ah, yes, well, as we mentioned earlier, we'll be in touch to schedule that in the next day or two. No need to rush down to the station." "So, of course," Jax said, his suspicion growing with each passing second. "I was just curious. What happened with those bikers you arrested? I didn't see them at the station." Another meaningful look passed between the officers, this one impossible to miss. "Oh, they've been processed and transferred to the county jail," Officer Grayson said smoothly, his tone just a little too casual. "Standard procedure for more serious offenses." Jax nodded, fighting to keep the skepticism out of his voice. "I see. Well, thank you again for your quick response this morning. Have a good rest of the day, officers." Sliding into the driver's seat, Jax made a split-second decision. As the officers climbed back into their cruiser, he waited until they pulled out of the gas station before following at a discreet distance. The quiet streets of his hometown suddenly felt alien and threatening as he tailed the police car, determined to uncover the truth behind this web of lies and corruption. The sun was beginning to set, and the streetlights flickered to life, competing with the fading light on the horizon and casting silhouettes across the road. As Jax followed the cruiser through the darkening town, he couldn't shake the sense that he was heading into something dangerous, even for his years as a Navy SEAL. But with his family's safety and the integrity of his community on the line, he knew he had no choice but to see it through to the end, no matter where it took him. The evening shadows lengthened as Jax carefully tailed the police cruiser through the winding streets of his hometown. The familiar landscape took on an ominous quality in the fading light, each turn revealing potential dangers lurking in the growing darkness. Jax's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension as he maintained a safe distance behind the officer's vehicle. The old sedan's engine hummed softly, a sound that had once been comforting, but now seemed to underscore the gravity of the situation. The car's interior still held the faint scent of his grandmother's perfume, a poignant reminder of what he was fighting to protect. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, realizing with a start that nearly 2 hours had passed since he left the bakery. Concern for his family nagged at him, prompting him to reach for his phone. Keeping one eye on the road ahead, Jax dialed Lorraine's number. The ring seemed to echo in the quiet car, each second of waiting ratcheting up his anxiety. "Jax," his mother's voice came through, tinged with worry. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," he assured her, trying to keep his voice steady and calm. "Just checking in. Have you and Granny closed up the bakery yet?" "Yes, we're on our way home now," Lorraine replied. Jax could hear the faint sound of their footsteps on the sidewalk, the familiar creaking of the old sign above the bakery door as it swung in the evening breeze. "We did exactly as you said, closed early and didn't disturb anything. Jax, what's going on? You sound tense." Jax hesitated, not wanting to worry them unnecessarily. The streetlights flickered on around him, casting pools of yellow light that seemed to emphasize the shadows between. "I'm still looking into a few things. Listen, when you get home, make sure all the doors are locked, okay? And keep something nearby that you could use as a weapon if you need to, just in case." "Jax, you're scaring me," Lorraine said, her voice quavering slightly. In the background, Jax could hear Maggie asking what was wrong, her tone laced with concern. "It's just a precaution, Mom," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'll explain everything later. For now, just stay safe and don't call the police no matter what. We don't know who we can trust." After ending the call, Jax refocused on the task at hand. The police cruiser had led him to the outskirts of the market district, an area that had seen better days. Once thriving shops now stood with boarded windows, their faded signs hinting at past glories. The few pedestrians still out at this hour moved quickly, heads down as if trying to avoid notice. Jax watched as the officers parked their car by the side of the road, apparently settling in for a patrol. He drove past slowly, then circled back around the block, his eyes scanning for any sign of suspicious activity. As he approached the market area again, a flickering neon sign caught his attention. Hal's Hardware glowed in red and blue, one of the few businesses still open at this hour. An idea formed in Jax's mind, and he pulled into the spacious yet cracked parking lot at the market's center. Stepping out, he approached on foot, his senses sharp and alert for any sign of trouble. The bell above the door jangled as Jax entered the hardware store, the sound harsh in the quiet store. An elderly man behind the counter looked up, his weathered face creasing into a smile of recognition. "Well, if it isn't little Jax Dawson," the man said, his voice gravelly but warm, "though I suppose you're not so little anymore. What brings you in so late?" Jax managed a small smile, the familiarity of the interaction, a stark contrast to the tension of the evening. "Hey, Mr. Hall, just need to pick up a few things." As he moved through the narrow aisles, Jax quickly gathered several new brass locks, an alarm system, and a small safe. He also grabbed a set of basic tools, his mind already formulating plans to increase security at the bakery and his family's home. Mr. Hal raised an eyebrow as he rang up the purchases. "Doing some serious home improvement, are we?" Jax nodded, not meeting the old man's eyes. "Just some upgrades, better safe than sorry, right?" The old shopkeeper's expression turned serious. "You be careful, Jax, there's been talk. Well, just watch yourself, okay?" The warning sent a chill down Jax's spine, but he simply nodded his thanks and left the store, his arms laden with bags. While carrying his purchases from the hardware store, Jax set off on foot toward Dawson's Hearth Bakery, located in a different section of the market from the hardware store. The street was eerily quiet now, with most of the day's business long since concluded. As he neared the bakery, the sight of the bikers' motorcycles still chained to the pole where Officer Harris had left them sent a fresh wave of unease through him. No officers had come to retrieve them as promised that morning. The machines loomed in the darkness, silent sentinels that seemed to mock the idea of law and order. When Jax reached the bakery's entrance, he found the door locked as expected. Remembering his grandmother's habit of keeping a hidden spare key, He began searching the usual spots. After a few moments, he found it beneath a potted plant, its familiar weight in his hand offering a small sense of comfort. As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the bakery's silence enveloped him. The air still held the faint scent of fresh bread and sweet pastries, but now it felt oppressive rather than comforting. Jax moved quietly through the space, checking each room and corner, half expecting to find an intruder lurking in the shadows. But he was safe. He switched on the single bulb above the door. The yellow light dimly illuminated the space. The bakery, once a haven of warmth and comfort, now felt alien and threatening. Jax's eyes had adjusted to the dim light, allowing him to make out the familiar shapes of counters and display cases. But even these well-known fixtures seemed to hold potential dangers in their shadows. As he set the shopping bag down behind the counter, Jax's eyes were drawn to the spot where the knife had fallen earlier. Crouching down, he confirmed that it was still there, untouched beneath the bread rack. The blade gleamed dully in the dim light, a sinister reminder of the day's events. As Jax straightened, his military instincts flared to life. If he turned the knife over to the police now, there was a good chance it would mysteriously vanish. But leaving it here was just as risky. What if the corrupt officers or their biker allies returned for it? His mind raced, weighing the consequences. The knife, still lying forgotten beneath the bread rack, was both a crucial piece of evidence and a potential threat. If he left it, someone else might stumble upon it, perhaps an unsuspecting employee, or worse, one of the officers looking to erase any trace of their involvement. Yet taking it with him felt like stepping onto a path he might not be able to walk back from. The weight of the decision pressed down on him as he stood in the dimly lit bakery, surrounded by the ghosts of better days. As he mulled over his decision, Jax turned his focus to installing the new locks he had purchased. He told himself he would decide what to do with the knife once the job was done. The rhythmic sounds of his work, the soft scraping of metal against wood, the quiet clicks of components fitting into place, offered a steady contrast to the turmoil in his mind. Each turn of the screwdriver felt like an act of quiet defiance against the forces threatening his family and community, a small but tangible step toward reclaiming control. The alarm system proved more challenging. Jax had to refer to the instructions multiple times, the small print difficult to read in the low light. But gradually the device took shape, its silent vigilance a comfort in the oppressive quiet of the bakery. As he worked, memories flooded back. He remembered standing on tiptoe as a child, watching his grandfather knead dough with strong, sure hands. He recalled his first attempts at decorating cakes under his grandmother's patient guidance, the icing more often on his fingers than the pastry. Each recollection strengthened his resolve. This place, this legacy, was worth protecting, no matter the cost. The last rays of sunlight had long since faded when Jax finally finished his task. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool evening air, a testament to the intensity of his labor. He stood back, surveying his work with a critical eye. The new locks gleamed dully in the faint light from the street, solid and reassuring. Just as he was about to turn his attention back to the problem of the knife, a sound from outside froze him in place. The low rumble of motorcycle engines growing steadily louder shattered the quiet of the night. Jax's heart began to race, adrenaline flooding his system as he recognized the sound. Moving swiftly but silently, Jax positioned himself kneeling behind the curtained window. Through a small gap, he could see the street outside. His breath caught in his throat as he watched a group of familiar figures approach the bakery. The three bikers from that morning were there, accompanied by two men in dark clothing whose faces were obscured by helmets. As the group began unchaining their motorcycles, Jax's suspicions crystallized. He was almost certain that the two masked men were Officers Grayson and Harris. The casual way they interacted with the bikers, the comfortable familiarity of their movements, it all pointed to a level of collaboration that went far beyond mere corruption. Jax's mind raced. He knew he couldn't confront them alone, the odds were too great and he had no backup. But he couldn't let them leave without trying to gather some evidence. His eyes fell on the knife still hidden beneath the bread rack. Making a split-second decision, Jax moved swiftly and silently. He retrieved a pair of disposable gloves from the kitchen and carefully picked up the knife, sealing it in a plastic bag he found under the counter. The weight of the weapon in his hands felt like a turning point. There was no going back now. Just as he finished securing the evidence, the sound of the front door opening shattered the silence. Jax's heart leapt into his throat as he realized he had been so focused on the knife that he hadn't noticed the group entering the bakery. He tried to make his way to the back exit, but it was too late. Two of the bikers rounded the corner, their eyes widening in surprise as they spotted him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a roar of anger, they lunged forward. Jax's SEAL training kicked in automatically. He dodged the first attacker's wild swing, using the man's momentum to send him crashing into a display case. Glass shattered, the sound deafening in the confined space. The second biker was more cautious, circling warily as he looked for an opening. But Jax was outnumbered, and in the tight confines of the bakery, his options were limited. As he fended off another attack, a third man entered the fray. A solid punch connected with Jax's jaw, sending him staggering backwards. As he struggled to regain his footing, one of the men in dark clothing approached. Even through his blurred vision, Jax recognized the stance and build of Officer Jake Harris. "You should have stayed out of this, boy," Harris growled, his voice confirming Jax's suspicions. The corrupt officer's eyes fell on the bagged knife in Jax's hand, and his expression hardened. With a swift movement, he snatched the evidence away. Jax tried to resist, but he was outnumbered and already battered. A kick to his midsection drove the air from his lungs, and as he gasped for breath, another blow to the head sent him spiraling towards unconsciousness. The last thing Jax saw before darkness claimed him was Harris's sneering face looming over him. The officer's words echoed in his ears as the world faded to black. "This was your last chance. Next time you'll be dead, little soldier." The sound of the door slamming echoed in the empty bakery, a final punctuation to the violence that had unfolded. As silence settled once more over Dawson's hearth, Jax lay motionless on the floor, the taste of blood in his mouth and the weight of failure pressing down on him. The bakery, once a symbol of his family's legacy and the heart of the community, now felt like a battlefield, the first skirmish in a war Jax had only begun to understand. Consciousness returned to Jax slowly, like a tide gradually washing over a shore. The first sensation to penetrate the fog of his mind was pain, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to radiate from every part of his body. He lay still, the cool tile of the bakery floor pressed against his cheek, a stark contrast to the heat of his injuries. The air around him was heavy with the lingering scents of the day's baking, yeast, sugar, and a faint hint of cinnamon, now tinged with the metallic tang of blood. In the distance, he could hear the muffled sounds of the town settling into night, a dog barking, the occasional passing car, the hum of streetlights flickering to life. With a groan, Jax forced his eyes open. The bakery was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the windows. He guessed the bikers must have shut off the lights inside before their escape. Shadows stretched and shifted in the gloom, warping the once familiar space into something unfamiliar and menacing. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body. The bright screen momentarily blinded him, causing him to squint as he checked the time. 9:47 p.m. He'd been unconscious for hours. As his vision adjusted, Jax took stock of his situation. His head pounded relentlessly, and he could feel the sticky warmth of blood on his face. Each breath sent a sharp pain through his ribs, suggesting at least one might be cracked. But he was alive, and that meant he still had a chance to set things right. Slowly, painfully, Jax pushed himself into a sitting position. The room spun around him, nausea rising in his throat. He closed his eyes, taking slow, shallow breaths until the feeling passed. When he opened them again, the bakery had stopped its nauseating dance, allowing him to focus on his next move. He knew he couldn't call the police, not when he had just confirmed that at least some of them were in league with the bikers. The thought of involving his family was quickly dismissed. He couldn't bear to put them in any more danger. That left one option: his old team. With trembling fingers, Jax scrolled through his contacts and dialed a familiar number. The ring seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet bakery, each second of waiting stretching into eternity. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was alert despite the late hour. "Eric," Jack said, his voice raspy and strained. "It's me, I need your help." There was a brief pause before Eric responded, concern evident in his tone. "Jax, what's wrong? You sound terrible." "Long story," Jax replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Can you meet me? I'll explain everything, but I don't want to say too much over the phone." "Of course," Eric said without hesitation. "Where are you?" Jax gave him the address of the bakery, then added, "And Eric, come armed. I don't know if we're still in danger." After ending the call, Jax forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the counter for support. His eyes fell on the toolbox he had brought in earlier, and an idea formed. He rummaged through it until he found a solid claw hammer. It wasn't much, but it was better than being completely defenseless. With the hammer clutched in one hand, Jax made his way to the back of the bakery. Each step was an exercise in willpower, his body protesting every movement. He peered out the window, scanning the darkened street for any sign of the bikers or corrupt officers. The road was empty, the only movement coming from tree branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Seeing no immediate threat, Jax cautiously unlocked the door and slipped outside. The cool night air helped clear some of the fog from his mind, but it also made him acutely aware of how vulnerable he was. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger, every small noise causing him to tense in anticipation of an attack. He made his way to where he had parked his grandmother's car, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. The familiar vehicle was a welcome sight, its presence oddly comforting in the midst of so much uncertainty. Jax climbed inside, locking the doors immediately. The interior still held the faint scent of his grandmother's perfume, a poignant reminder of everything he was fighting to protect. As he waited for Eric to arrive, Jax's mind raced. The corruption clearly ran deeper than he had initially suspected. How many officers were involved? How far up the chain of command did it go? And most pressingly, how could he protect his family from this threat? A tap on the window nearly made Jax jump out of his skin. He relaxed when he saw Eric's familiar face peering in at him, concern etched deeply in his features. Unlocking the doors, Jax gestured for his friend to get in quickly. Eric's eyes widened as he took in Jax's battered appearance. "Jesus, man, what happened to you?" Jax took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in his ribs, and began to recount the events of the day. He told Eric about the initial confrontation at the bakery, his suspicions about the officer's behavior, and finally the ambush that had left him unconscious on the bakery floor. As he spoke, Eric's expression grew increasingly grim. When Jax finished, his friend was silent for a long moment before speaking. "This is big, Jax. Bigger than just a couple of corrupt cops and some thuggish bikers. We're talking about organized crime with hooks in local law enforcement." Jax nodded, the movement sending a fresh wave of pain through his head. "I know, and I have no idea how deep it goes or who we can trust." Eric drummed his fingers on the dashboard, thinking, "We need more information, and we need to secure evidence that can't be easily dismissed or lost by corrupt officials." "I had evidence," Jax said bitterly. "The knife they used to threaten my grandmother, but they took it when they jumped me." "Okay, so we start from scratch," Eric said, his tone determined. "First things first, though, we need to get you checked out. Those injuries look nasty." Jax shook his head. "No hospitals, they'll ask too many questions, and I can't risk word getting back to the wrong people." Eric sighed but nodded in understanding. "All right, then we'll patch you up as best we can ourselves. But Jax, we can't do this alone. We need backup. People we can trust absolutely." As if on cue, Jax's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Lorraine, no doubt worried about his prolonged absence. He answered, keeping his voice as steady as possible as he reassured his mother that he was fine and with a friend. Gently but firmly, he reminded her not to open the shop tomorrow and urged her to give the staff the day off. After ending the call, Jax turned to Eric with renewed determination in his eyes. "You're right. We can't do this alone. I think it's time we called in some favors from our unit. Whatever's going on here, we're going to get to the bottom of it and put an end to it. For my family's sake and for the whole town." Eric nodded, a grim smile playing on his lips. Just like always, huh? Diving headfirst into danger to save the day. As they pulled away from the curb, heading towards Eric's place to regroup and plan their next move, Jax couldn't help but feel a mix of dread and excitement. This wasn't the homecoming he had expected, but he was damned if he was going to let these criminals destroy the town he loved. Whatever it took, he would see justice done. The streets were nearly empty as they drove, the town having settled into the quiet rhythms of night. But beneath the peaceful facade, Jax knew a storm was brewing, and he was determined to be ready when it broke. The drive to Eric's house was tense, with both men on high alert for any sign of pursuit. Jax's head throbbed in time with the car's movement, each bump in the road sending fresh waves of pain through his battered body. Despite his discomfort, his mind raced, piecing together the events of the day and trying to formulate a plan. Eric's house was a modest single-story structure, set back from the street and partially hidden by large oak trees. As they approached, the shadows cast by the trees seemed to dance in the headlights, creating an eerie, shifting landscape. Eric scanned the area carefully before pulling into the driveway, his hand hovering near the concealed weapon at his hip. Once inside, Eric quickly engaged multiple locks and an advanced security system. The soft beeps and clicks of the alarm being set echoed in the quiet house, a reminder of the danger that now lurked in their once peaceful town. "Bathrooms down the hall," Eric said, gesturing. "First aid kits under the sink. Get cleaned up while I make some calls." Jax nodded gratefully and made his way to the bathroom. The bright lights made him wince, but they also allowed him to fully assess his injuries for the first time. His reflection in the mirror was a sorry sight. A nasty gash above his left eyebrow, a split lip, and the beginnings of what promised to be an impressive black eye. The right side of his face was swollen and discolored, testament to the force of the blows he'd received. As he cleaned and bandaged his wounds as best he could, Jax could hear Eric's muffled voice from the other room. He caught snippets of conversation. "Need your help. Corruption. Not sure who to trust." The gravity of their situation weighed heavily on him as he dabbed antiseptic on his cuts, each sting a sharp reminder of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. By the time Jax emerged from the bathroom, feeling marginally more human, Eric was just ending his last call. The living room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the walls. Eric's face looked drawn and serious in the low light. "I've reached out to a few of our teammates. Some of them are off duty," Eric explained, handing Jax an ice pack for his swollen eye. "They're willing to help, but it'll take some time for them to get here without raising suspicion." Jax nodded, wincing as he applied the ice pack. The cold seeped into his skin, numbing the pain slightly. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get. In the meantime, we need to start gathering evidence, something concrete that we can take to the authorities. The real authorities, not the local cops." Eric's brow furrowed in thought. He paced the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. What about surveillance? If we could get video evidence of the bikers and cops working together, that would be hard to dismiss. "It's risky," Jax said, sinking into a nearby armchair. The soft cushions felt like heaven to his aching body. "But it might be our best shot. We'd need to set up cameras at key locations, the bakery for sure, and maybe near the police station, if we can manage it without being seen." As they discussed logistics, the weight of exhaustion began to press down on Jax. The events of the day, coupled with his injuries, were taking their toll. Eric noticed his friend's drooping eyelids and insisted he get some rest. "Take the guest room," Eric said, his tone brooking no argument. "We'll start fresh in the morning." Jax wanted to protest, to push on despite his fatigue, but he knew Eric was right. He was no good to anyone in this state. With a grateful nod, he made his way to the spare bedroom and collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to remove his shoes. As he drifted off to sleep, Jax's last thoughts were of his family, his mother's worried face, his grandmother's kind smile. He silently vowed to do whatever it took to keep them safe and bring the corrupt elements in their town to justice. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of conspiracy hanging over the town. Jax awoke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of voices. Groaning as his battered body protested the movement, he made his way to the kitchen. Eric was there, along with two familiar faces, Mike and Sarah, fellow Navy SEALs who had served with Jax and Eric on several missions. They looked up as Jax entered, their expressions a mixture of concern and determination. "Jesus, Jax," Mike said, taking in his friend's bruised face. "You look like you went 10 rounds with a grizzly bear." Sarah, ever practical, was already on her feet, guiding Jax to a chair. "Sit. I'll check those bandages." As Sarah fussed over his injuries and Eric poured him a much-needed cup of coffee, Jax filled Mike in on the situation. The kitchen, with its warm light and familiar sense of breakfast, felt surreal against the backdrop of corruption and violence they were discussing. Mike's expression grew increasingly grim as Jax recounted the events of the previous day. When Jax had finished, his friend was silent for a long moment before speaking. "This is serious stuff, man," he said, his voice low and intense. "We're talking about taking on not just a biker gang, but corrupt cops too. It's not going to be easy." "I know," Jax replied, wincing as Sarah applied antiseptic to a cut he hadn't even noticed. The sting was sharp, but it helped clear his head. "But we can't just sit back and let them terrorize the town. These are good people, my family, my neighbors. They don't deserve to live in fear." Eric, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "I think I might have an idea," he said, his eyes lighting up with sudden inspiration. "The commander. He might be able to help us." Eric raised an eyebrow. "Commander Reynolds. You think he'd get involved in something like this?" Jax nodded, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his injuries. From his position, he must have connections in the police force, someone we can trust who's willing to look into this. "That's actually a great idea," Eric said, a hint of excitement creeping into his voice. "If we can get official backing, even unofficially, it could make a huge difference." Without further hesitation, Jax pulled out his phone and dialed Commander Thomas Reynolds' number. As the phone rang, Jax couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for disturbing the commander. "Reynolds," came the gruff answer after several rings. "Commander, it's Jax Dawson. I apologize for the call, sir, but we have a situation that requires your attention." There was a pause, and Jax could hear the faint sounds of children and family chatter in the background. "This better be important, Dawson," the commander said, his tone a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. Jax took a deep breath and began explaining the situation, the corrupt officers, the biker gang, the threats to his family and the community. As he spoke, the background noise on the commander's end faded, replaced by a tense silence. When Jax finished his explanation, the commander's voice had lost all traces of irritation. "This is serious, Dawson." "Very serious. Where are you now?" "At Eric's place, sir. We've got a team assembled, but we need help from someone we can trust in law enforcement." "Stay put," Commander Reynolds ordered. "I'm calling in a few favors. I'll be there within the hour with someone I trust implicitly. And Dawson, good work bringing this to my attention." The call ended, leaving Jax and Eric exchanging looks of relief and anticipation. Help was on the way. True to his word, Commander Reynolds arrived at Eric's house less than an hour later. With him was a stern-looking man in a sheriff's uniform who introduced himself as Sheriff Cobalt Harris. "Sheriff Cobalt is one of the few men I'd trust with my life," Commander Reynolds explained. "He's been suspicious of some irregular activities in the area for weeks now, but didn't have enough evidence to act on it." Sheriff Cobalt nodded, his weathered face creased with concern. "I've been trying to piece together what's been happening, but it's been difficult without solid proof. If what you're saying is true, this could blow the lid off a major criminal operation." For the next few hours, the group worked tirelessly to develop a comprehensive plan. Sheriff Cobalt provided invaluable insights into police procedures and potential weak points in the corrupt officers' routines. Commander Reynolds coordinated with other off-duty SEALs, ensuring they had the manpower and resources needed for the operation. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through Eric's living room windows, they had a solid plan in place. It was risky, but with the combined skills of the SEAL team and the official backing of Sheriff Cobalt, they stood a real chance of exposing the corruption and bringing the criminals to justice. "All right, people," Commander Reynolds said, addressing the assembled team. "We move tonight. Get some rest, check your gear, and be ready. This isn't just about one town or one family anymore. This is about upholding the oath we all took to protect and serve. Let's make it count." Jax had spent the entire day buried in research, making phone calls and holding strategic meetings. Eric's house had quickly transformed into an impromptu base camp, a temporary command center where they could plan their next steps without prying eyes. Sheriff Cobalt had provided extra information from the research and information he had gathered so far, including repeated trends, activities, and base camps. In the afternoon over the phone, Jax had laid everything out for Lorraine and Maggie. Why he hadn't come home last night, what had transpired at the bakery yesterday, and the disturbing fact that the crucial piece of evidence had gone missing. His mother listened carefully, her worry evident in every pause, every shaky breath on the other end of the line. "If we open the shop today, it might be easier to catch them," Lorraine suggested, her voice both cautious and determined. "If the bikers or those officers are watching, they'll make a move to extort money from us again, and we'll be ready." Jax clenched his jaw, already shaking his head before she had even finished. "No," he said firmly, "it's too risky." He understood her reasoning, but the bakery wasn't a battleground. It was their home, their livelihood, a place built on trust and community. He wouldn't turn it into bait, not when the enemy had already proven they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. For now, they needed to play it smart, gather more information, and most importantly, stay one step ahead. As night descended, the team sprang into action. Jax and Eric, joined by several other team members, positioned themselves strategically around the Rusty Nail bar. With the owner's permission, they set up surveillance, aware of the delicate balance they had to maintain. The owner had confided in them about his struggles with controlling the bikers, frequenting his establishment, and extorting his customers for protection money. The sheriff had been a big ally. His information proved invaluable. He had shared details about the corrupt officers' patrol schedules and the recent spike in biker activity at the bar. Thanks to this intel, Jax and the team were able to time their operation perfectly, setting the stage for what they hoped would be a crucial breakthrough. The air was thick with tension as they monitored the area, knowing that any misstep could tip the scales in favor of those they were trying to expose. But with everything lined up, they were ready. "Sheriff Cobalt just called in," Eric reported, his voice low as he spoke into his comm unit. "Grayson and Harris are supposed to be patrolling Oak Street tonight. There's a good chance they'll stop by the bar." Jax nodded, his eyes never leaving the bar's entrance. "Copy that. Everyone stay alert. We need clear evidence of collusion." Hours passed as they watched and waited in hiding from a distance. The bar was busy, with a steady stream of bikers coming and going. Jax's heart raced every time the door opened, anticipating the arrival of the corrupt officers. Finally, just after midnight, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Officers Grayson and Harris stepped out, looking relaxed and casual as they entered the bar. "They're here," Jax whispered into his comm. "Everyone in position. Remember, we need clear video and audio evidence." Inside the bar, hidden cameras captured footage of the officers making their way to a back room. The biker gang's leader, a burly man Jax recognized from his previous encounter, greeted them like old friends. For the next hour, the team watched and recorded as the cops and bikers discussed their criminal enterprise in detail. They talked about protection money, drug shipments, and plans to expand their operation. "They're talking about using the bakery as a front for drug distribution," Jax reported, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "That's their main goal. I agree that Grandmother's Bakery looks vintage and would be a good cover for them, but these plans they're concocting are insane. If they think they can rob my family blind, bankrupt us and steal the place or somehow control us to hide their distribution. His words trailed off, but the fury in his eyes spoke volumes. We've got them with this footage. As the meeting wound down, Jax prepared to give the signal to move in. But before he could, Sheriff Cobalt's voice came over the comm. We've got movement at the police station, he reported. Looks like they're mobilizing for something big. Be careful, boys. Jax exchanged a worried glance with Eric. This wasn't part of the plan. Could they be onto us? He wondered aloud. Before they could decide on a course of action, the back door of the bar burst open. The corrupt officers and several bikers emerged, looking agitated. Change of plans, Officer Grayson was saying through the CCTV footage. We need to move the shipment now. Someone's been asking questions at the station, and they might already hear. This was their chance. Jax gave the signal, and the team sprang into action. Sheriff Cobalt and his deputies, along with the SEAL team members, converged on the bar from all sides. Police, freeze! Sheriff Cobalt's voice boomed through a megaphone. Chaos erupted. Some of the bikers tried to flee, while others reached for weapons. But they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Within minutes, the entire group was subdued and in custody. As Jax and the other SEALs helped secure the scene, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. They had done it. They had exposed the corruption and brought down the criminal operation that had threatened his family and his town. As the chaos of the arrest began to settle, Jax found himself face to face with the 3 bikers who had attacked him at the bakery, along with Officers Grayson and Harris. The group was handcuffed and being led to the waiting police vehicles, but their faces were twisted with anger and defiance. Officer Grayson, his uniform now a mockery of the authority it represented, sneered at Jax. Well, well, if it isn't the little soldier boy playing hero, you think this changes anything? The biker leader, whom Sheriff Cobalt recognized as Victor Slater, strained against the handcuffs, his muscles bulging with defiance. He spat on the ground at Jax's feet, his eyes narrowing with malice. You have no idea what you've done, boy, he hissed. We've got friends in high places. This ain't over. His sneer was laced with venom, as though the situation had only fueled his determination to exact revenge. Turning to Sheriff Cobalt, he gave a mock salute. And nice seeing you again, Sheriff. After all these years, who could have guessed we'd meet like this? Funny how things work out, considering you failed to catch me back in San Francisco. His words dripped with disdain, as if the weight of past encounters still hung between them. Despite the cuffs and the mounting pressure, the biker's confidence never wavered. Jax stood his ground next to Sheriff Cobalt and Commander Reynolds, his face impassive as he met their glares. It's over for you, he said calmly. Your days of terrorizing this town are done. Officer Harris let out a harsh laugh. You really believe that, don't you? We're just the tip of the iceberg, kid. There's more of us than you can imagine in every town, every city. You can't stop us all. The taunts and threats continued as the prisoners were led away, their voices rising in a cacophony of anger and mockery. Jax could feel his team tensing around him, ready to intervene if the situation escalated. But Jax remained calm, his voice steady as he addressed the captured criminals. You're right about one thing, he said. This isn't over, but not in the way you think. We'll keep fighting, keep exposing corruption wherever we find it, and we'll win, because there are more good people in this world than there are people like you. As the police vehicles drove away, sirens blaring, Jax turned to his team. Their faces showed a mixture of triumph and determination. Sheriff Cobalt approached, a grim smile on his face. Good work, everyone, he said, clapping Jax on the shoulder. We've got them dead to rights. The evidence you gathered is rock solid. As the criminals were led away and the investigation team began combing the scene, Jax felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't over. There would be statements to give, trials to attend, and a long process of rebuilding trust in the community. But the worst was behind them. He looked around at his team, Eric, the other SEALs, Sheriff Cobalt and his deputies. They had come together to fight for justice, to protect the innocent, and to uphold the values they all believed in. In that moment, Despite the long night and the challenges still ahead, Jax felt a profound sense of pride and gratitude. The aftermath of the raid unfolded in a blur of activity. Jax found himself at the center of a whirlwind of law enforcement personnel, from local deputies to state police, who had been called in to assist with the large-scale operation. Commander Reynolds and Sheriff Cobalt coordinated the efforts, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly documented and secured. The parking lot of the Rusty Nail had been transformed into a makeshift command center, with police vehicles and evidence vans lining the perimeter. Jax watched as the corrupted officers, Grayson and Harris, were processed separately from the other arrestees. Their faces were a mixture of anger and defeat, as their badges and weapons were confiscated. It was a sobering sight, a stark reminder of how power could corrupt even those sworn to protect and serve. As the night wore on, Jax found himself giving a formal statement to a stern-faced detective. He recounted every detail, from the initial threat at the bakery to the final confrontation at the bar. The weight of the past few days pressed down on him as he spoke, the reality of what they had uncovered and the potential ramifications for the town sinking in. The clock on the wall of the makeshift interview room showed 2 a.m. when Jax finally finished his statement. Exhaustion tugged at him, but he knew he couldn't rest yet. There was still work to be done. Stepping back out into the cool night air, Jax saw the knife, the piece of evidence that had started this whole investigation, being carefully bagged and tagged by a forensics team. Nearby, boxes of what he assumed were drugs and other illicit materials were being catalogued and loaded into secure vehicles. Eric approached, looking as tired as Jax felt. "Hell of a night, huh?" he said, a weary smile on his face. Jax nodded, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, but we did it. We actually did it." Their moment of quiet reflection was interrupted by Sheriff Cobalt and Commander Reynolds, who walked over with purposeful strides. "Good work, boys," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with respect. "We've got enough evidence here to put these bastards away for a long time, but this is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us to clean up this town." Jax nodded solemnly. "Whatever you need, Sheriff. We're here to help." As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the SEAL team gathered for a final briefing. Commander Reynolds addressed them, his face showing pride in their accomplishments. "You've all done exemplary work," he said, his tone steady with genuine pride. "What you've achieved here goes beyond just one town or one criminal operation. You've struck a blow against corruption and shown what can be accomplished when good people stand up for what's right." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the group, appreciating their dedication. "Though this is not an official mission, it seems like it's turned into one," he added with a slight smile. "I gave you boys some off-duty time after our last mission, but it seems like you can't help but get yourselves into trouble, huh?" His voice was light-hearted, the playful remark easing the tension in the air. The team exchanged tired but satisfied laughs and smiles, a sense of camaraderie settling over them. Despite the exhaustion etched on their faces, there was an undeniable satisfaction in the air. They had come together once again, faced danger and uncertainty, and emerged victorious. It was a victory not just for them, but for the community they had fought to protect. In that moment, the weight of the mission felt lighter, and the bonds they had forged grew even stronger. As the briefing concluded, Jax felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Eric, keys in hand. "Come on," Eric said. "Let's get you home. Your family's probably worried sick." The drive back to Jax's house was quiet, both men lost in thought about the events of the night and the challenges that still lay ahead. As they pulled up to the curb, Jax could see lights on inside despite the early hour. "Thanks, Eric," Jax said as he climbed out of the car. "For everything." Eric nodded, a smile on his face. "Anytime, brother. Get some rest. We've earned it." As Jax walked up the path to his front door, he heard it open before he could reach for his keys. Lorraine and Maggie stood in the doorway, their faces a mixture of relief and concern. "Jax!" Maggie exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug. "Oh, thank goodness you're all right." Lorraine joined the embrace, and for a moment Jax allowed himself to relax into the warmth and love of his family. When they finally separated, he saw the questions in their eyes. "It's over," he said simply. "The people who threatened you threatened the bakery. They've been arrested. We're safe now." As they ushered him inside, peppering him with questions he was too tired to fully answer, Jax felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. There would be time for explanations later, time to deal with the aftermath of what had happened. But for now he was home, he was safe, and the town he loved was on the path to becoming whole again. Maggie, ever practical even in times of stress, was already talking about reopening the bakery. "They'll need to do an investigation first," Jax cautioned, "but after that, yes, we'll get everything back to normal." "Normal sounds wonderful," Lorraine said with a tired smile. As the first rays of sunlight began to stream through the windows, Jax allowed himself to truly relax for the first time in days. The danger had passed, justice was being served, and a new day was dawning, not just for his family but for the entire town. There would be challenges ahead, he knew, rebuilding trust, rooting out any remaining corruption, helping the community heal from this betrayal. But as Jax looked at the determined faces of his family, he knew they would face whatever came next together. The Dawson family had weathered storms before, and they would do so again, stronger and more united than ever.